The summer of 1940 was a season of fire and fear. Britain stood alone, a besieged island with its back to the sea. Every morning, the people woke to the wail of sirens and the thunder of Luftwaffe bombers over London, Portsmouth, and Dover. Yet, high above the chaos, silver wings cut through the clouds. The supermarine Spitfire, Britain's proud defender. Sleek, elegant, fast, the very image of hope. But as the Battle of Britain dragged on, a silent enemy began to stalk the skies. It wasn't the Messerschmitts. It wasn't the flak. It was heat. Pilots began reporting the same chilling story. Engines cutting out mid-flight, coolant boiling over, and once proud Spitfires plummeting into the channel. Not from gunfire, but from the betrayal of their own hearts of steel. The Merlin 3-engine, Rolls-Royce's masterpiece, was running too hot. Designed for controlled tests, not relentless combat, it was now pushed past its limits. Long climbs, tight turns, and bursts of power left the cooling system gasping. The engine would seize, the propeller would stop, and the pilot would have only seconds to bail out or brace for the sea. At first, engineers blamed the pilots. Improper throttle use, they said. Then they blamed the mechanics. Poor maintenance, they muttered. But as the weeks went by, even the test bays at Derby began showing the same failure. Engines melted under load, pistons fused, and coolant tanks hissed and boiled like kettles left on too long. Behind the brick walls of the Rolls-Royce plant, tension brewed hotter than the engines themselves. Sir Stanley Hooker, the brilliant aerodynamicist, worked tirelessly to squeeze more power from the Merlin, but every improvement brought more heat and more danger. Supermarine's test pilots sent telegrams begging for a solution. Engines cooking after 5 minutes at climb power, one note warned, pilots refusing to fly. And yet, amid the panic, one quiet voice from the countryside began to stir. His name was Arthur Dobson, a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken man from Derbyshire. He wasn't a university man. He didn't have a degree or even an engineering title. His hands were rough from years spent fixing steam plows and threshing engines on farms. But he had an instinct, a deep, almost intuitive understanding of machines that came from living with them, day after day, under open skies. Arthur had once worked as a part-time fitter for Rolls-Royce, maintaining their older field equipment. But his new workshop was a modest shed behind his farmhouse, stacked with oily tools and spare boiler pipes. When news of the overheating crisis reached the countryside, Arthur listened with quiet concern. He knew engines, and he knew that heat, if not carried away, would kill even the finest design. As he read about the Merlin's failures in the newspaper, he muttered to himself, "They're trying to cool it like a tractor, but a plane's not a field machine." He set down his tea, walked out to his shed, and stared at a dismantled steam plow engine. He ran his fingers along the brass tubing and water jacket. He could see it clearly. The problem wasn't power, it was flow. The Merlin's cooling system was elegant but fragile, built for precision, not for punishment. That night, he began sketching. A new type of radiator flow system. A change in the coolant loop. Nothing revolutionary, just practical. Something that could be built fast and work under stress. He wrote a letter to Rolls-Royce, explaining his theory and attaching his rough drawing. He never expected a reply, and for weeks, he didn't get one. But the letter didn't vanish. It landed on the desk of a young engineer named Peter Henshaw, overworked, desperate, and willing to listen to anyone who had a new idea. He read Arthur's words twice. Then, he showed it to his superior. The man laughed. "A farmer solving the Merlin's heat issue?" Rubbish Henshaw didn't laugh. He sent a telegram to Arthur instead. "Come to Derby. Bring your sketch." Arthur looked at the message, folded it carefully, and placed it in his pocket. The next morning, he boarded a lorry heading to Derby. He didn't know it yet, but his simple, rejected idea would soon keep the most famous aircraft in history from falling out of the sky. Arthur Dobson arrived at the Rolls-Royce plant just after dawn. The gates were buzzing with workers, hundreds of men and women streaming in, their faces gray with fatigue, but burning with quiet resolve. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil, metal, and cigarette smoke. Engines lined the benches like steel hearts waiting for life. A young man in a grease-stained lab coat waved him over. "Mr. Dobson?" "Peter Henshaw. You're the one with the cooling idea, aren't you?" Arthur nodded shyly. "I don't know if it's an idea. Just something I've seen with steam engines. Flow matters more than size." They walked through the testing floor, where a Merlin 3 howled on a stand. Its silver casing gleamed under the lights, but even from a distance, Arthur could see the telltale shimmer of heat around the radiator pipes. "It's fighting itself," he murmured. Henshaw frowned. "We've tried everything. More coolant, new alloys, even bigger radiators. Nothing keeps it steady." Arthur leaned closer to the drawings pinned on the wall. "That's the problem," he said softly. "You're making it bigger, not faster." He grabbed a pencil and began sketching over the blueprint. A small, deliberate rerouting of the coolant system that would force the liquid to circulate faster under pressure. "You need a swirl," he said. "A way for the coolant to pull the heat off evenly, instead of sitting still near the hot spots. You do this, and you'll keep her heart cool, no matter how hard she runs." Henshaw stared at the sketch. It was crude but brilliant, an improvised swirl chamber design that mimicked the cooling systems used in old steam threshers. Simple, cheap, effective. They tested the first version that night in secret. No approval, no supervisors. Just 2 men in a corner of the factory, rigging brass pipes and valves into a prototype Merlin. When they fired it up, the temperature gauge held steady. 5 minutes. 10. 15. No boil. No hiss. Arthur just smiled. "That's how a machine should breathe." Henshaw grinned. "You've done it." By morning, word had spread through the factory floor. "The farmer fixed it." Some laughed. Some refused to believe it. But when Rolls-Royce's chief engineer saw the data, he went silent. Then, he ordered the new design to be fitted into the next batch of Merlins immediately. Within weeks, Spitfire squadrons began receiving the modified engines. Pilots noticed it right away. They could climb higher, dive longer, and push their planes harder without fear of heat death. The Merlin purred through the toughest dogfights like a living creature reborn. No one outside the factory ever heard of Arthur Dobson. No medals, no headlines. But among the engineers, his name became a whispered legend. The farmer who cooled the fire. He returned to his workshop in Derbyshire, back to his plows and boilers, never realizing that his quiet brilliance had just saved Britain's most vital aircraft. And perhaps the war itself. By September of 1940, the skies above Britain had become a furnace. The Luftwaffe pressed harder than ever, sending waves of bombers and fighters across the Channel day after day. The world's fate seemed to hang on the wings of a few hundred Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambling from makeshift airfields scattered across southern England. But something had changed. The young pilots of the RAF, many barely out of school, began to notice it first. Their planes no longer coughed and wheezed after long climbs. The needles on the temperature gauges no longer danced toward the red. The smell of burning coolant that once haunted every sortie was gone. The Merlin engines now ran smooth and cool, relentless, alive, roaring with newfound confidence. At Biggin Hill, Flight Lieutenant James "Jock" Forbes leaned over his cockpit, eyes wide in disbelief. "She's holding steady at full climb," he shouted over the radio. "No boilover. None." His wingman laughed through the static. "Maybe they've finally given us magic engines." No one knew yet that the miracle had come from a farm workshop in Derbyshire, from the mind of a quiet man named Arthur Dobson. To the pilots, it felt like divine intervention. To the engineers at Rolls-Royce, It was something even rarer, a triumph of simple wisdom over complex theory. The improved swirl chamber coolant system, hastily implemented, barely tested, had transformed the Merlin 3. Instead of stalling under heat stress, it now handled the punishing G-forces of combat with ease. It could race full throttle for minutes on end, climb steeply into the thin, freezing air, and come back down without choking. It was as though the Merlin had learned how to breathe again. Reports flooded into the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Squadrons were surviving longer, fighting harder, and shooting down more enemy aircraft. Spitfire losses due to engine failure had dropped to near zero. In the shadowed boardrooms of Rolls-Royce, men in suits quietly congratulated themselves. None of them mentioned the name of the farm mechanic whose rough pencil sketch had made it all possible. But deep inside the Derby factory, where the floor workers labored day and night assembling engines, Arthur Dobson's story had become a whisper of pride. The farmer did it, they'd say over tea. Save the Spitfire, he did. Meanwhile, out in the fields of Derbyshire, Arthur had gone back to his old life. His days were filled with the rhythm of machinery, oiling gears, repairing boilers, and helping neighbors fix their tractors. He never expected to hear from Rolls-Royce again. Until one afternoon, a letter arrived bearing the company's seal. Dear Mr. Dobson, it read, we wish to invite you to a demonstration of the new Merlin engine variant, which you helped improve. Your attendance would be most welcome. Arthur stared at the letter for a long time. He didn't think he had helped improve anything. He'd just fixed what seemed broken. But something inside him stirred. A sense of curiosity. Pride, perhaps. Or disbelief that his small workshop idea had truly made a difference. He took the early train to the testing airfield outside Derby. The sky that morning was the color of steel, low clouds rolling in from the north. A row of brand new Spitfires gleamed on the tarmac, their noses marked with fresh Merlin engines. When the first one started, the sound hit him like thunder. Deep, clean, powerful. The kind of sound that made your bones vibrate. As the plane took off, Arthur watched it climb into the clouds, not once sputtering or straining. He could feel tears stinging his eyes. That's your doing, Mr. Dobson, said Henshaw, who had come to greet him. Your swirl design made it through the trials. The pilots say it runs like a dream. You've given her lungs again. Arthur smiled faintly. I didn't give her lungs. I just stopped her from drowning. He stayed until sunset, watching the planes return one by one, engines purring. The sound filled him with quiet satisfaction. He didn't need applause. The sky was his proof. The Battle of Britain reached its crescendo that autumn. London burned nightly, its skyline painted orange by flame. Every dawn brought new raids, and every dusk brought the weary silence of survival. In those desperate months, the Merlin engine became Britain's heartbeat. The factories in Derby, Crewe, and Glasgow worked day and night, turning out engines faster than ever, each one stamped with quiet defiance against the storm. In the skies above, the Spitfire's song had changed. It no longer coughed under strain or gasped for air in combat. It roared. Pilots pushed harder, fought longer, climbed higher. The Merlin, once delicate, had become unbreakable. And with every flight, Arthur Dobson's hidden gift proved itself again. On September 15th, 1940, what Churchill would later call the turning point of the war, the Luftwaffe launched its largest assault yet. Over 1,000 German aircraft swarmed toward England in formation. The RAF scrambled every Spitfire and Hurricane it had left. Among them, the new Merlin-cooled Spitfires performed miracles. Pilots like Jock Forbes and Teddy Lee Mallory reported being able to maintain full power for entire dogfights without the engines overheating, something unthinkable only weeks before. The engines never faltered, Forbes would later write, not once. I owe my life to that machine. At Biggin Hill, ground crews stood on the grass, cheering as Spitfires roared home with victory reports crackling over the radio. 56 enemy planes destroyed. The Luftwaffe forced to retreat. It was the beginning of the end of Hitler's dream of conquering Britain. Back in Derbyshire, Arthur listened to the victory broadcast on his old radio. Churchill's voice filled the room, measured, proud, eternal. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Arthur smiled quietly. He thought of the pilots, their bravery, their skill, but part of him also thought of the engines, the unseen few, the quiet machines that had endured alongside the men. His wife turned to him and asked, "Do you think what you did made a difference?" Arthur simply looked out the window at the twilight sky. Somewhere up there, a Spitfire was returning home on the wings of his idea. "I think," he said softly, "it helped her keep flying." He never told anyone that the swirl chamber was born not in a laboratory, but in a farm shed between a boiler and a plow. He never asked for recognition or reward, or even a mention in the reports that followed. But the engineers knew. The pilots knew too, even if they never learned his name. Because when Britain's survival hung in the balance and the Spitfire began to fail, one farm mechanic's rejected idea gave her back her life, and with it gave hope to an island that refused to fall. By 1941, the war had expanded far beyond Britain's skies. The Luftwaffe had turned east toward the Soviet Union, and across the Atlantic, America had begun to stir. The arsenal of democracy was waking, and with it came new partnerships, new machines, and new ambitions. For Arthur Dobson, life had returned to something resembling normal. He still rose at dawn to the sound of the crows, still walked to the small workshop behind his cottage, where the air always smelled faintly of grease and hay. But every so often, he'd receive a letter from an old colleague at Rolls-Royce. Most were short, polite updates. "Your cooling system has been incorporated into the new Merlin 45 model." Or, "The Americans are taking interest in our design." He would read them quietly, sip his tea, and set them aside. He didn't quite understand the scale of what was happening. Not until one letter arrived in the spring of 1942 with a foreign postmark. It came from a town he had never heard of, Packard Motor Company, Detroit, USA. Inside was a neatly typed message. "Mr. Dobson, your original coolant. Chamber configuration has been essential to our replication of the Merlin engine for the American P-51 Mustang program. The results have exceeded all expectations." Arthur set the letter down slowly. He stared out the window at his fields, still brown from winter, waiting for spring. America, he thought. His farm-born idea had crossed the ocean. The P-51 Mustang at that time was just another fighter, fast, agile, but limited by range. The Americans wanted something that could escort bombers deep into Germany, something that could protect the skies where others could not reach. When they fitted it with the British Merlin, complete with Arthur's improved coolant circulation, it became unstoppable. In the spring of 1943, Allied bombers began flying farther and hitting harder. Over the factories of the Ruhr, over Hamburg and Berlin, Mustangs appeared like phantoms, climbing high, staying strong, returning home long after others would have overheated or failed. To the German pilots, they were a nightmare. To the Allied airmen, they were salvation. And in some quiet, invisible way, every one of those flights carried a piece of Arthur Dobson's invention. A small, uncredited swirl of cooling metal that kept the engine's heart beating. Back in Derbyshire, word of the Merlin's new life in America reached the local papers. The headlines spoke of Britain's engine winning the war, but they never mentioned the man behind its quiet transformation. Arthur didn't mind. He'd seen enough to know that war was not about names. It was about survival. And if his bit of metal and oil could keep young men alive, that was enough. Still, some nights, when the wind was right, he would walk out to the field behind his home and listen. High above, faint but steady, he could hear the distant hum of engines crossing the sky, training flights from nearby bases. He would close his eyes and smile. The sound was pure and even, No stutter, no strain, the sound of life and of legacy. By mid-1944, the war had turned decisively in the Allies' favor. The invasion of Normandy was underway, and Europe's liberation had begun. Above the beaches, the air was thick with the roar of aircraft, Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mosquitoes, Mustangs, all powered by the ever-evolving Merlin. For Arthur, each headline was both pride and pain. Every victory was bought with fuel, steel, and blood. And though he knew the engines were saving lives, he also knew they were taking them too. The world's deadliest machines now ran on his cooling system. It was a thought that haunted him in quiet moments. One summer morning, Arthur received another letter, this one from a pilot stationed in Normandy. Dear Mr. Dobson, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I've been told you're the man responsible for the new cooling system in our Merlins. If that's true, then you've saved my life twice now. Both times I was in a steep climb, under fire, and the gauges stayed steady. I made it home. Thank you. We call it the engine that never quits. Arthur read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in a drawer beside his workbench. He never replied. He didn't know what to say. What could a farm mechanic say to a man who fought in the clouds? That autumn, Rolls-Royce finally invited him to London for a quiet recognition ceremony. Not an award, just a handshake, a thank you dinner, a nod from the ministry. It was more than he ever expected. The meeting took place in a modest office, its walls covered with blueprints and photographs of aircraft factories. Engineers, officers, and government men were present, all polite, all formal. When they introduced Arthur, he simply said, "I just wanted to keep the engine cool enough to come home." There was a pause, followed by applause. Afterward, one of the senior engineers pulled him aside. "You know, Dobson," he said, "your little design flaw might have been the best thing that ever happened to us." Arthur chuckled softly. "Flaw, was it?" The man grinned. "Every great invention starts as a flaw." As he left the building that night, the streets of London were still scarred by bomb damage, but the city was alive, rebuilding, refusing to fall. Above, the sky was clear, and faintly, from a nearby airfield, came the familiar thrum of a Merlin engine. Arthur stopped to listen one last time. He thought of the years behind him, the rejections, the trial runs, the factory heat, the endless tinkering. And he thought of the pilots, soaring on the strength of a simple idea, born not in a lab, but in the heart of a farmer who refused to give up. He smiled and turned toward the train station. "She'll keep flying," he murmured. "She always will." The war would end within a year. Arthur Dobson's name would fade from the official histories, but his design would live on, powering peace, exploration, and generations of engineers who believed, as he did, that sometimes the smallest changes make the biggest difference. Because when Britain's future hung by a thread, one forgotten mechanic's mind kept the Spitfire and the hope of freedom alive in the skies. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the skies above Europe no longer echoed with the shriek of engines. They were quiet now, like a great orchestra that had played its last note. In the factories of Derbyshire and the airfields of southern England, thousands of workers who had lived by the rhythm of production suddenly stopped. The endless hammering of metal, the roar of test benches, the cry of mechanics shouting over noise, all faded to silence. For Arthur Dobson, it was strange. For 5 long years, every waking hour had been tied to the war's desperate heartbeat. Every bolt he turned, every cooling line he tested, had meant a pilot's life. Now, with peace declared, the urgency was gone. The world had survived. The Spitfire, that graceful machine that once burned itself alive in the heat of its own glory, had lived to see victory. And quietly, beneath its shining aluminum skin, Arthur's cooling system kept ticking, steady as a heartbeat. He never spoke of it much. He never called it his invention. To him, it had been a fix, a practical solution to a problem that men in offices had complicated. But those who knew him, The fitters and the flight engineers who had worked alongside him in the summer of 1940 knew better. They remembered the day he walked into Rolls-Royce with that crude sketch drawn on brown wrapping paper. The day the farm mechanic from Derbyshire outthought the company's top engineers. The war had proven him right. The modified cooling design he proposed, simple and elegant, had allowed the Merlin engine to keep its power, even under brutal combat conditions. No more vapor locks, no more mysterious mid-air engine failures. The pilots who survived never knew his name, but every time they climbed out of a Spitfire alive, they had him to thank. As victory parades filled London, Dobson stayed home. He listened to the celebrations on his small radio, pipe smoke curling in the dim light of his kitchen. His wife asked if he'd go see the planes fly one last time over the city. He only shook his head and smiled. "They fly fine," he said. "That's all that matters." He returned to his farm, to the familiar scent of oil and earth. The old steam plow still stood in the shed, its gears rusted with years of neglect. He spent his days repairing tractors, fixing combine harvesters, and helping his neighbors prepare for a new season, not of war, but of rebuilding. But sometimes, late at night, he'd pause at the edge of his field and look up. The stars were quiet again, and somewhere among them, he could still hear the faint hum of a Merlin engine, carried on the wind. His engine, his work, his legacy. He'd never wear a medal or stand in front of cameras. But in the quiet of Derbyshire, that didn't matter. The men who fought, the machines that flew, the country that survived, all of them had been lifted in some small way by the hands of a farm mechanic who refused to stop thinking. Time is cruel to memory. Heroes fade, factories change names, and the world forgets who kept it turning. By the 1950s, the Spitfire had become a relic of the past. New jets ruled the skies, and the sound of propellers was replaced by the thunder of afterburners. Rolls-Royce moved on to bigger engines, sleek, powerful turbines for the new jet age. But in the old archives, deep within dusty files stamped War Department Confidential, a few engineers stumbled across the name Dobson in the margins of a cooling report. The handwriting was rough, the ink smudged. But it was there, an annotation beside a line drawing. Suggested by A. Dobson, field mechanic, Derbyshire. They didn't know who he was, but they noticed something else. The same principle he'd used in the Merlin, that simplified airflow and pressure distribution, was quietly being reused in new designs. The farm mechanic's solution had outlived the war. It had become a foundation stone in the engines of peace. Arthur himself never knew. He died in 1953, his obituary no longer than a paragraph in the Derbyshire Gazette. It spoke of a respected mechanic and veteran engineer, with no mention of his wartime work. But a year later, a young test pilot at RAF Cosford was shown an early Rolls-Royce jet engine during training. His instructor pointed to a curved intake and said, This came from a cooling system designed back in the Merlin days. A farmer figured it out, believe it or not." The pilot smiled. He didn't know the name, but he would never forget the story. That's how legacies survive. Not in the ledgers of corporations or the pages of history books, but in the small stories passed from one craftsman to another. A man's life becomes a lesson whispered across generations. Never stop thinking. Never assume you can't change the world because of where you come from. Decades later, when a group of aviation historians began restoring an original Battle of Britain's Spitfire, they found Dobson's work again, hidden in plain sight. The restored aircraft's cooling system bore a unique configuration found in only a handful of surviving airframes. Stamped faintly on one of the pipes, nearly worn away by time, were the initials, AD. No one knew how they got there. Perhaps a worker in the factory had added them in secret as a quiet tribute to the man whose idea had saved so many lives. Perhaps Arthur had marked it himself, on a visit long forgotten. Whatever the truth, those two letters stood as a symbol, the signature of a man who never asked for recognition, but whose work spoke louder than any medal. Today, when that Spitfire takes to the skies at air shows, roaring once again above the English countryside, its engine still carries a trace of Arthur Dobson's mind. The crowds look up and see a machine, elegant, proud, immortal. But what they're really seeing is a legacy. One man's stubborn refusal to accept that a problem was unsolvable. He wasn't an engineer, not by title. He had no degree, no laboratory, no team of draftsmen. All he had were his hands, his tools, and a mind shaped by years of fixing what others gave up on. That was enough. Because sometimes the greatest victories in history aren't won by generals or even pilots, but by quiet men in grease-stained overalls, standing alone in a workshop, refusing to give up on an idea that everyone else called impossible. And as long as the Spitfire flies, so does the spirit of Arthur Dobson, the farm mechanic who saved Britain's wings.